As Putin paces his office, he is nervous. Despite his outwardly calm demeanor and projected strength on his state-controlled media outlets, he is a wreck in private. Since 2014, he has tried to take over Ukraine with no luck. In 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of the country to decapitate the democratically elected government and install a Russian-controlled puppet. After launching his so-called special military operation that was supposed to take Kyiv in 3 days, he has been fighting a war of attrition against a nation that refuses to give in despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Even after spending tens of billions of dollars, losing more than 10,000 pieces of equipment and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, he is still not any closer to declaring victory than when he started. Because of his military's host of setbacks on the battlefield, Putin has turned to increasingly desperate measures to win the war, recruiting convicted murderers, raising mercenary armies, conducting bombing campaigns against civilian targets, deporting masses of civilians to Russia, and other crimes that have done nothing but harden Ukrainians' resolve to win the war. And as Putin has tried various tactics to win the war, so too has the US and NATO done their part to help Ukraine succeed. Over the past several years, the US alone has contributed over $175 billion to Ukraine's war effort, with almost $70 billion of that being direct military aid in the form of all types of weapons and ammunition for land, sea, and air requirements. NATO countries have also given significant money, amounting to over $30 billion in economic aid and $40 billion in direct military aid. Because of the huge amount of Western aid flowing into Ukraine, Russian formations have been brought to a standstill due to a smaller army being able to force itself several orders of magnitude thanks to these weapons donations. And that's where Putin has a problem. Putin has routinely called for Western aid to stop flowing into Ukraine and has threatened several so-called red lines for aid that would trigger a larger response from him. Chief among these red lines has been the delivery of the F-16 fighter jet. Though the F-16 airframe is several decades old, modern midlife upgrade packages during the early 2000s brought these tried-and-true fighter jets into the contemporary era. With newly refurbished airframes, new radars, computers, weapons, and other sensors, the modern F-16 can go toe-to-toe with some of Russia's best aircraft, like the Su-34 and Su-35. This is a problem for Putin. Though Ukraine's air force remains viable after years of fighting, its role remains limited due to its small size, older planes, less advanced radars, and shorter-range weapons. As a result, the Ukrainian Air Force's sortie generation is sometimes up to 40 times less than Russia's ability to launch aircraft each day. However, thanks to the dearth of air defense systems that Western backers have provided, the Ukrainian armed forces are still able to contest the skies over Ukraine through a combination of short, medium, and long-range systems. However, recent developments may finally tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. Recent media reports show that Belgium has pledged to donate 30 of its surplus F-16 fighters in exchange for newer F-35s. This pledge has now pushed the total number of committed F-16s for Ukraine to 85. Though these planes may not arrive in theater for some months, or potentially years, due to retrofitting and pilot training, this number of F-16s is what Ukraine says it needs to gain local air superiority along a sector of the front. If Ukraine were to gain air superiority in a specific area, like Kherson for example, its forces could use this as a weapon to reel back Russian advances sector by sector until pushback to the 2014 line of contact, or potentially to the international border itself. Such a possibility is a disastrous scenario for Putin, and he would certainly choose a drastic course of action to prevent the defeat of conventional Russian forces on the battlefield. Another reason why Putin might make good on his promise to escalate the war is because of Ukrainian attacks on Russia itself. Over the past several years, Ukraine has attacked Russia numerous times with drones that have crippled air bases far inside Russia and resulted in some hilarious countermeasures like placing tires on top of multi-million-dollar airplanes to prevent their destruction. Recently, however, these attacks have ramped up to affect Putin's bottom line, his oil industry. Because Russia is essentially just a giant gas station that supplies huge quantities of oil and natural gas to the world, this serves as Putin's main way of obtaining foreign cash to back up his worthless rubles. Since January 2014, Ukraine has been attacking Putin's oil industry in earnest by launching at least 15 recorded drone attacks against oil refineries across Russia, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from Ukraine. These attacks have crippled up to 14% of Russia's oil refining capacity at a time and forced Putin to announce a 6-month freeze on fuel exports to ensure price stability at home. Despite America's urging to stop attacking inside Russia, Ukraine continues its strikes unabated. As Putin's military struggles to shoot down these drones, it's a huge political embarrassment for him, since he has already stated that companies should seek to purchase their own air defense systems since the Russian military cannot afford to buy any more. If Ukraine continues these attacks, or they get worse and worse, this too might be the tipping point if public sentiment goes against him and he's seen as weak. Whether caused by a perceived loss on the battlefield or having his seat of power threatened at home, Putin would take drastic action to save his shattered dream of reinstating a modern USSR. But what would a war be like? Hour 0. As the West continues to watch the war in Ukraine unfold, Putin continues to make veiled threats in the media. While Putin has been saying these things for years, Western nations do not take him seriously anymore, since they assume he could not be so foolish as to start a peer-to-peer war with the US and NATO while still trying to conquer Ukraine. But that's exactly what Putin is planning. Thanks to Western preoccupation with Ukraine, Putin has been able to replenish his forces engaged in Ukraine with new ones. This is not uncommon for him, for since the war started, the Russian military has raised 2 new combined arms armies it has sent to Ukraine from a mixture of contract troops, volunteer groups, private military companies, and prisoners. Shifting these forces from the front lines to Belarus and northern Russia for rest and refit is a common occurrence now. This is because Russia has built up strategic-level reserves through Putin's crypto-mobilization efforts that target ethnic minorities, economically disadvantaged communities, and petty criminals, which brings in nearly 30,000 personnel each month. Of course, Ukraine inflicts around 1,000 casualties per day on the Russian military. Still, because of these mobilization efforts, Putin has steadily built up his current army from around 1.1 million troops to 1.5 million soldiers, due to around 300 to 400,000 Russians signing enlistment contracts each year, which is the target set by the former Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. With his new army of 400,000 troops, just over the size that Putin had used to invade Ukraine in 2022, Putin intends to deploy them in a surprise invasion meant to shock NATO into stopping support for Ukraine. But where would Putin strike? Though Putin might be mad, he does have some measure of realism in his body. Expecting the Russian army to muster enough personnel and material to invade the entirety of NATO is simply an absurd suggestion that even his staunchest supporters would advise him against. Instead, he intends a 2-pronged, limited invasion of Eastern Europe meant to fracture the NATO alliance and gain some territory for himself while he's at it. The most likely candidate for this strike would be the Baltics. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are the most exposed countries in the alliance and have a nasty history with Russia. After gaining independence after World War I, the USSR invaded and occupied these countries in 1940. After decades of communist rule, they were among the first socialist republics to declare independence and among the first to join NATO after the USSR fell. Because of their decades of Soviet rule, there are significant populations of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within these countries. Touting the same line of reasoning that he did with Ukraine, Putin would likely telegraph in the media that these countries were trying to abuse or somehow eradicate these ethnic Russian people. As Putin would have his press fear-mongering in the papers, trying to disrupt European governments like he always does, these 400,000 new troops would slip quietly into position in Belarus and the western military district of Russia. But what would Putin's strategic plan be? Though it's hard to speculate on the inner thoughts of a madman, it's likely that Putin would want to use his army quickly to overrun the Baltic countries before the US and NATO had a chance to respond. But in order to do so, he would need to cut off access to the Baltics through a strategic choke point called the Suwalki Gap. The Suwalki Gap is the unofficial name of a roughly 60-kilometer territory stretching from the Russian Kaliningrad exclave on the Baltic coast across the northeastern Polish border with Lithuania and stops in Belarus. This sparsely populated area is a critical choke point for the US and NATO alliance. Control of this area means that the Baltics are cut off from mainland Europe. Holding the line here for Putin would mean that he could block the expected NATO counterattack. At the same time, he consolidates control over the Baltics and forces the US and NATO to the negotiating table over Ukraine. But how would that invasion play out? Hour 1. As Putin launches his invasion, the first Russian troops to enter the Baltics and the Suwalki Gap are not conventional forces, but are actually Putin's little green men. Earning this moniker from the earlier invasion of Crimea in 2014 due to wearing Green Army uniforms with no insignia, these private military contractors are the advanced guard of Putin's army, meant to seize key objectives like bridges, roads, government buildings, radio stations, and military barracks to allow regular troops to enter freely. Instead of moving in regular army vehicles, the little green men instead ride in converted civilian 4x4 trucks, SUVs, and other commercial vehicles to try to blend in with the local population. Their goal is to seize their objectives through surprise and speed, so they want to avoid drawing attention to themselves as they cross the international border. Assisting these little green men in the first hour of the invasion is an extensive network of spies and collaborators Putin's security services have developed over the years. Because of the significant number of Russian minorities and former communists in the Baltics and other European countries, state intelligence and police services routinely make contact with these individuals via online platforms, social media, rallies, bars, concerts, and other traditional recruitment methods. By fostering relationships with disenfranchised locals who are sympathetic to Russia, Putin hopes that he can use them as on-the-ground intelligence when the invasion kicks off to serve as guides for the little green men, spot targets for Russian aircraft, and relay NATO troop movements to Russian forces. As the little green men encounter their first NATO checkpoints, the troops wonder what the heck is going on here. Though there is frequent movement in these countries due to the nearly 10 brigades of Baltic and NATO forces stationed there, US and NATO troops do not travel with firearms in personal vehicles. But before they realize what's happening, it's too late, as these men quickly overwhelm border checkpoints across the Baltics. After securing these border checkpoints and other vital objectives within several kilometers of the border, the little green men signal to conventional Russian formations to begin driving inland. While waiting in formations on the Russian side of the border under the protection of camouflage netting and GPS jammers, Russian armored and mechanized units begin lurching forward to advance into the Baltics. Their objective is similar to trying to take Kyiv. Since Kyiv is roughly 210 kilometers from Russian territory, the Russian High Command hopes to replicate the failed invasion attempt on Kyiv by driving straight towards the capital cities of Riga and Tallinn, which are about 200 kilometers from the Russian border. However, Lithuania's capital city, Vilnius, is only about 40 kilometers from the Belarusian border. Because of its close proximity to Belarus, Putin's generals hope to arrive in Vilnius by the first day and the other two capitals by day 3. As Putin's armored columns begin to traverse the Baltics, they encounter scattered resistance for the first hour. However, after overcoming the invasion's initial shock, resistance becomes more organized and coordinated among the NATO defenders. They know they cannot hope to fight and win against the Russians all by themselves. They are hoping to buy enough time for US and NATO reinforcements to come and roll the Russians back to the international borders of Russia and Belarus. But NATO ground troops aren't the only ones getting clobbered in the first hour of Russia's invasion. Putin knows that to win this war, he needs to secure the Baltics and close the Suwalki Gap within a week. Anything longer than a week, and he runs the risk of not only general mobilization of NATO countries, but also the threat of massive American reinforcements crossing the Atlantic. But crossing the Atlantic will take a week, and this does not account for the several days of mobilizing and loading American ships before the journey. Because of this, he intends to target bases where NATO's Rapid Response Force intends to mobilize first. NATO's Rapid Response Force is the premier organization within NATO, intended to rapidly deploy to crisis zones within hours or days, depending on the need. This force is comprised of land, air, and sea assets that combine troops from across every NATO country into a combined arms army that can sustain operations for several months without needing reinforcements for resupply. At the beginning of the invasion, about 50,000 NATO Rapid Response Forces were forward deployed in the Baltics, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. About 30,000 of these troops were stationed in the Baltics. The bulk of the Rapid Response Force is stationed in Poland, with around 100 members there as of May 2024, and the rest are stationed throughout Europe, with the bulk of the remaining personnel, air assets, and supply bases stationed in Germany. It's these major troop concentrations in Germany and Poland that Russia wants to knock out before they are mobilized for the rescue of the Baltics. Russia intends to eliminate these groupings through the use of long-range precision fires. Though the fog of war prevents accurate data from coming out, it's known that Russia maintains one of the world's largest inventories of conventional missiles. With close to 24 missile types of all varieties, the missile threat posed by Russia, even after years of conflict in Ukraine, should not be underestimated. In fact, despite sanctions, Russia has continued to maintain the inventory of its conventional short, medium, and long-range missiles. In attacking NATO positions in Poland and Germany, Russia would conduct a multi-tiered attack coming from different directions. For longer-range targets up to 2,500 kilometers away in Germany, like the Ramstein air base, Russia would launch a barrage of Kh-55, Kh-101, and Caliber cruise missiles from the Kaliningrad exclave, Belarus, and Russian ships in the Baltic Sea. For targets in Poland, like the US Army base at Poznan, Putin could use the hypersonic Kinzhal missile, with a max range of around 500 kilometers, in addition to medium-range ballistic missiles and repurposed air defense missiles like the S-300 or S-400. In addition to these missiles, Russia would certainly launch hundreds of Shahed 136 drones. The Shahed drones, known as kamikaze drones in the media, are one-way attack drones meant to blow up targets on impact. Since the war in Ukraine started, Russia has bought thousands of these drones from Iran and has even created a factory in southern Russia to build thousands more to meet Russian military demand. Because of the Shahed 136's extensive range, around 2,500 kilometers, the Russians can use them when attacking faraway targets with long-range ballistic missiles. Due to this fact, the Russians have changed their tactics to include Shahed drones as a sort of diversion in multi-layered, multi-threat air attacks. The purpose of using a bunch of Shahed drones would be to confuse NATO radar systems and waste precious time and ammunition shooting these down while much larger missiles come in for the kill. But much to Putin's surprise, his barrage of hundreds of long-range missiles and drones has little effect on NATO defenses. This is due to the integrated air defense network the US and NATO has spent decades building across Europe. The integrated air defense network currently in place is the most sophisticated in the world. Beginning with ground radar sites, almost every NATO country has at least 3 ground-based radar sites, with some countries having as many as 10. These radar sites all operate at various ranges, frequencies, and elevations to capture data on threats flying in at any level and any profile. In addition to this robust network of radar sites, the NATO alliance has something Russia does not: an advanced airborne early warning system. Known as the E-3 Sentry, these Airborne Early Warning Command and Control Planes, or AWACS for short, are the eyes and ears of NATO in the sky. These Boeing aircraft have a massive radar dome that allows US and NATO forces to see threats up to 400 kilometers away. With just 3 of these aircraft, they can provide an overarching picture of Central Europe. With 14 total AWACS in service, which does not even include the ED Hawkeyes from any American carrier strike group nearby, the alliance can see these missiles coming a long way away. As the AWACS and ground-based radar stations throughout the Baltics, Poland, Germany, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and others pick up Russian missiles, this information is shared with the battle management coordinators in Germany. As this information is fed to Allied commanders in real time through secure data links, NATO forces are able to begin striking down these targets. As NATO's short, medium, and long-range anti-air fires begin taking out incoming Russian missiles, F-15s, F-22s, and F-35s, along with other Allied aircraft, begin scrambling from air bases across Europe to intercept these threats. While the ground-based defenses are worried about the ballistic missile threats, the aircraft will take over, shooting down the incoming drones. And the result is not good for Russia. Just like what happened in the Middle East earlier this year, even this advanced multi-threat attack was almost entirely defeated. While a handful of hundreds of drones and missiles fired by Russia make it through, few actually strike their targets. This is because Russian precision munitions is more of a suggestion than a fact. The war in Ukraine has shown that Russian precision weapons are more of a fairy tale than reality. While estimates vary due to the fog of war, some show that Russian missile attacks are routinely 30 feet to more than 3/4 of a mile off. On average, such inaccuracies are seen about 40% of the time for all Russian missiles. With such a high margin of error, the missiles and drones that somehow make it through NATO's air defense network cause little damage and few personnel casualties. Overall, major bases like Ramstein, Stuttgart, and Poznan continue operations as usual. Hour 2. After the first wave of Russian missile attacks failed, US and NATO aircraft began setting up combat air patrol stations throughout Poland and the Baltics to build a protective screen while more reinforcements arrive. As Allied pilots arrive, they find that the skies are eerily empty. Though scanning for some of Russia's best fighter aircraft to intercept, like the Su-34 or Su-35, Allied aircraft instead establish communications and begin conducting close air support missions for garrisons surrounded by Russian troops. But where is the Russian Air Force? Due to the intensity of Ukrainian air defense systems, the Russian Air Force almost categorically refuses to enter frontline combat. So what do? Instead of setting up rival combat air patrol stations or conducting strategic strikes deep within NATO territory, Russian combat aviation instead hangs back behind the front lines and lobs air-launched cruise missiles into the fray. Why they do this is for several reasons. For one, Ukraine has proven that Western anti-air defense systems are, without a doubt, the best in the world. Between the variety of short, point defense systems to Patriot, IRIS-T, and everything in between, Russia's air forces suffered heavy losses to these systems and cannot afford to take much more. This is because the high sortie rate in Ukraine has put excessive hours on Russian aircraft frames and make them capable of flying less hours. In addition, Russian pilots have less experience dogfighting than their NATO counterparts due to serving as missile lobbers for the last few years. The new pilots do not get training to fight like Western pilots. Instead, as NATO aircraft enter Polish and Baltic airspace, the skies are void of Russian aircraft, but thick with anti-air defenses and missile fire. Because Putin wants to preserve his air force, he holds them back behind this massive screen of air defense systems. While some Allied aircraft are able to score hits on these missile sites, the strength and depth of enemy air defenses, which includes missile sites within Russia and Belarus that fire with impunity, start wreaking havoc among NATO aircraft. Though NATO Air Force commanders asked to fire on these SAM sites in Russia and Belarus, the Supreme Allied Commander orders them to stand down for now. At this moment, they want to limit this war to include only the borders of NATO countries and not fire into Russia or Belarus. However, NATO headquarters in Brussels calls an emergency meeting with European heads of state to discuss a way forward. During this conference call, President Biden, alongside most NATO partners, agreed that US and NATO forces should not fire into Russia or Belarus. While some disagree, like the heads of state of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the reasoning is that the war should be limited to the confines of NATO territory and not Russia or Belarus to give Putin the propaganda victory of somehow saying NATO had attacked Russian territory first to justify the invasion. Instead, the Supreme Headquarters decided to send a naval force to the Baltics to provide air cover for its fighters so they could attack Russian columns. Up in the North Sea, the orders arrive at the flagship of the standing NATO maritime group to make best speed for the Baltics. The transit to get there will take just over 2 days until their Aegis missile system can be in range to start detecting missiles and shooting them down. But the Russian Navy has other plans. Due to the emissions control conditions set by this surface action group, Russian forces in Kaliningrad were unable to get an accurate fire control solution with missiles. Instead, they sent orders to their submarines to take out any Allied warships making their way to the Baltics. These orders reach the commander of a Yasen-class submarine as she picks up the acoustics of warships nearby. The Yasen-class submarine is one of the most advanced submarines in the Russian arsenal. Due to its heavy armaments of torpedoes and cruise missiles and its stealth technology, it's very difficult for any ship to pick up on her. As the lead ship of the formation closes her, the Russian submarine fires a spread of torpedoes. The sailors on board the American destroyer have just seconds to react before several torpedoes close in on her wake and slam into her stern. Though the sailors on the Russian submarine rejoice in their first kill of the war, they do not know that they are now the hunted ones. The other ships in company pick up on the acoustics of the enemy submarine and begin to close in. A circling P-8 Poseidon aircraft, along with 2 MH-60 Romeo helicopters equipped with dipping sonar, begin prosecuting her position. Within a matter of minutes, the crew of a nearby destroyer has a positive firing control solution and conducts an urgent attack on the Russian sub. Before she knows it, 3 torpedoes come at her, and the Russian sub tries to do an emergency dive to avoid them. However, it's too late. On board the American destroyer, the sonar technicians hear the sound of 4 underwater explosions. On the surface, oil slick and human remains float to the surface. The American Navy has now drawn first blood. As the US and NATO ships of Snigem 1 resume their transit to the Baltic Sea, the situation on the ground is becoming grave in the Baltics. Russia committed about 100,000 soldiers to each of its objectives. On the ground, NATO troops are outnumbered by a factor of almost 4 to 1. The Russian armored columns began advancing toward them after the Little Green Men pushed through the initial border areas. However, due to the chaos of the situation, the defenders are able to form hunter-killer teams to take out Russian armor columns due to the abundance of Javelin and other personal anti-tank weapons. As NATO troops begin to take out more Russian armored vehicles, it appears they have the upper hand. As Russian armored convoys are attacked from the sides and the rear, they stop and dismount their infantry to take out NATO anti-tank gunners harassing them. When they do so, the columns become vulnerable to precision fires in the form of Excalibur GPS-guided artillery shells, HIMARS rockets, and other advanced weapons. As US and NATO forward observers call in these fire missions on exposed Russian columns, they watch in anticipation as they see and hear rounds coming in. However, what happens next surprises them. As round after round of GPS-guided munitions fall in close to the Russians, it appears that in the last moments, these rounds fly wildly off course. While some of them hit close enough to cause casualties, the bulk of the Russian columns remain untouched. But how can this be? As the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, the Russian military has proven itself capable of learning from at least some of its mistakes. One of these critical mistakes was not having enough protection for its units from precision-guided munitions. As a result of being pummeled by Ukraine for the last couple of years, Russia has actually invested heavily in new electronic warfare technology that's been capable of defeating some Western weapons. Reports from Ukraine have shown that in some cases, the effectiveness of Western precision-guided weapons fell below 10% as a result of Russian jamming. Because of this, Putin has mandated that all important Russian formations and objectives be shielded with GPS jammers to render these Western weapons useless. However, he failed to realize that electronic warfare has other spectrums too. Russian communications is one of the spectrums that the US and their NATO allies soon exploit. As their performance in Ukraine has shown, the Russian military is practically incapable of securing their communications or using proper emissions control techniques to mask their plans. There exists online literally thousands of hours of recorded phone calls by Russian soldiers on unencrypted commercial cell phones discussing sensitive military operations. In addition to this, Russian troops frequently communicate in the clear on radio frequencies that are unencrypted. While they do change radio frequencies often, there is also evidence of Ukrainian civilians intercepting Russian communications and harassing them. While these make for some good internet comedy, this inability to communicate securely has real-world consequences. Russian troops in the Baltics soon learn that their air defenses have beaten back Allied planes for now. NATO soldiers know exactly where Russian formations are, since they do not even attempt to hide their communications. With this real-time intelligence, US and NATO troops conduct numerous fire missions with traditional tube artillery, self-propelled artillery, and mortars to at least delay, if not stop, Russian advances. Though outnumbered for now, troops in the Baltics know help is on the way due to the mobilization of NATO's Rapid Response Force. Hour 8. Since the Russian invasion began just after dawn, the defenders in the Baltics have successfully prevented the Russians from making major gains. Though Vilnius is within range of Russia's artillery, rockets, and other indirect fire systems, the capitals of Estonia and Latvia remain free from attack, since the fighting is still concentrated within 20 kilometers of the border, or at least NATO thought. Throughout the day, Russian transport helicopters have made their way through a hail of NATO air defenses to land elite airborne and Spetsnaz special forces at airports just outside all three capitals. On the ground, local garrisons have brought down large numbers of helicopters from short-range man-portable systems like Stinger and Starstreak. However, enough helicopters have made it through to land inside each capital. The goal of these airborne operations is simple. The Russians hope to surprise the defenders and overwhelm them in a sharp, quick action. Once done, they will radio for more, waiting for transports to fly in larger numbers of paratroopers and conventional infantry to establish a land bridge in the city so that the Russians can now attack from two directions. But there is a problem with that. Because this is the same tactic Russia tried in Kyiv, the NATO troops defending in the Baltics anticipated this move and have been preparing to shoot them down. Through withering ground fire, a few helicopters managed to land at each airport. However, in short order, the attackers are wiped out by infantry stationed at the airport. Mopping up operations will continue for several more hours, but the immediate danger is now over. But where are the reinforcements? Back in Poland, the bulk of the 100,000 NATO troops have received their equipment and are on the march towards the Suwalki Gap. Russia, for its part, conducted a two-pronged invasion from both Kaliningrad and Belarus to shock the defenders there and rapidly seize the gap to begin fortifying it before help could arrive. Stationed in the gap are about 30,000 Polish and NATO soldiers, well armed with hundreds of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and air support from several nearby air bases. However, during the initial bombardment, this area bore the brunt of the bulk of Russia's short and medium-range missiles from multiple angles. As a result, units stationed here suffered moderately high casualties in the first hours that have degraded their combat effectiveness. Making the situation worse is the fact that Russian air defenses have essentially created a wall of steel that's been difficult for Allied air forces to penetrate. As a result, the forces here are largely on their own and face the largest number of Russian and private military troops as they attempt to stem the tide of the invasion. But they do have one thing on their side. Due to the terrain, the area is heavily forested and there are not many major roads. Due to this, the Russians are forced to use the few roads there are for their armored vehicles, which makes them easy targets for indirect fire and anti-tank teams. But despite inflicting heavy casualties, the Russians rapidly advance due to overwhelming numerical superiority. At this point, US and NATO commanders have a decision to make. With the Navy still almost a day away, there will not be enough top cover to protect Allied planes from attack, and with the 100,000-strong response force still about half a day away, drawing equipment from Poznan, the commanders decide that the best course of action is to wait and stay where they are. Though they cannot trade space for time, they simply have no other option. Back in Brussels, the US and NATO leaders decide to hold a high-level war council about what to do next. It's agreed that, as previously stated at the Vilnius summit in 2023, the Baltics will not be abandoned, to be retaken at a later date. Instead, the strategy is to hold the area for as long as possible until reinforcements arrive from North America and the UK. In the meantime, NATO countries agreed to mobilize 25% of their militaries for war and place them under a unified American command. With such a decision, the US would have 850,000 personnel, 881 fighter aircraft, over 3,000 tanks, and 687 ships, among other equipment. Once assembled, these forces will begin an immediate counteroffensive, while the bulk of the US military arrives from North America to provide a strategic reserve and much-needed firepower. After deciding on a firm course of action, President Biden informs Congress that the United States is invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty and that the country is now in a state of war with Russia. He then asks the Congress to officially vote on the matter. In an unusual sign of bipartisan support, Congress declares war on Russia and states that the war will end only when all NATO territory has been regained. With war now being declared, the president has numerous powers he could choose to mobilize the country. Among these is requisitioning the 181 ships of the US Merchant Marine to be under the control of the Military Sealift Command. Also in his power is the ability to charter commercial cargo planes for military use. Overnight, FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service are all mandated to carry military cargo to help ferry the invasion force to Europe. But the question is, will there be anything left to defend once they get there? Day 1. In the first 24 hours after the start of the invasion, the Russian military made some decent progress. It's currently about 10 kilometers from Vilnius, and the city is experiencing intense indirect fire and air attacks. In Latvia and Estonia, the Russian gains have been greater, since the NATO force of about 10 brigades has had to defend an area the size of West Germany. As a result, the furthest afield Russian units have made it about 30 kilometers. But there is just one problem. Because Russia anticipated to have advanced much further than it did, Russian commanders had not stocked units with enough fuel and ammunition since they had planned on capturing NATO stocks. With Russia still fixed in place to contain Ukrainian forces, not enough fuel and ammunition has been spared. With Russian supply lines dangerously exposed from their railheads in northwest Russia and Belarus, truck convoys must continually make trips to the front lines to deliver supplies. And this is where Russian command and control hurts them. Due to having just 2 serviceable airborne early warning aircraft similar to the AWACS, the A-50, Russian commanders are blind to most of what's going on in front of them. Because of this, Allied units are frequently able to fix Russian units in place with snipers and small squads, while larger formations are able to flank around and attack Russian troops from the side or rear. Because of these frequent ambushes, senior Russian commanders become impatient and routinely head to the front lines to figure out what's going on. Due to their unencrypted communications, they become easy targets for Allied gunners or aircraft. Despite this, the Russian army continues to advance, since they're doing their best to bypass hardpoints and instead send second-line conscripts and prisoners to fight positional battles, while contract troops and private military contractors form the spearhead to push toward the capitals. Because of the Russians' rapid advance in Lithuania, the troops in the Suwalki Gap are quickly becoming surrounded on 3 sides. Fortunately, help is on the way soon. Day 2. As Snigum 1 comes around Denmark and makes a beeline for Poland, the group has been continually harassed and attacked by Russian fighter aircraft. Thankfully though, none of the missiles fired at US or NATO ships have hit due to how good Aegis has been. But what scares US commanders is as they get closer to Kaliningrad, they will sail under a gauntlet of missile fire. But thankfully, the group has an ace up their sleeve. Because of the presence of a US aircraft carrier, the carrier aircraft comes equipped with its own fighters, airborne early warning aircraft, and electronic attack aircraft. These electronic attack aircraft, known as the FA-18 Growler, are equipped with electronic jamming pods and HARM missiles, which are radar-seeking munitions used to target surface-to-air and anti-ship cruise missile sites. As the cruisers and destroyers of the NATO strike group provide protection for the Growlers, they close in on Kaliningrad with one mission: clear the way for the fighters and ships to go through. As the Growlers near the exclave, Russian fighter jets scramble to meet them. However, land-based F-35s and F-22s join the Navy F-18s to establish local air superiority. After downing dozens of Russian aircraft, the Growlers close in for the kill. True to their mission, their missiles home in on radar sites all across the exclave, making the Russians there virtually blind. With the air lanes now clear, the whole might of American air power begins pounding the exclave. Every available type of aircraft begins dropping bombs. By the end of the day, the vast majority of their air defense missile sites have been destroyed, their stockpiles of long-range missions have been wiped out, and the surviving Russians holed up in underground bunkers wait for the day to pass. But that day would not come, thanks to the Navy. With the sea lanes now clear from anti-ship cruise missiles, the US Navy and its allies close in closer to shore. Though Kaliningrad has been rendered combat ineffective, Russian air defense sites still operate with impunity across Russian territory and Belarus. Because of this, if Allied planes want to safely support the counteroffensive, the Navy will need to provide mobile air defense for them. Back on land, the fight is not looking good for NATO. Russian forces have advanced more than 60 kilometers across the Baltics and are now fighting in the suburbs of Vilnius. In the Suwalki Gap, NATO troops are doing their best to defend against a multi-axis attack. However, despite inflicting heavy losses on Russian troops, fresh units are brought in from Belarus. Additional Russian units also drove right past Vilnius and banked hard to the south to surround survivors in the area. However, Russia is doing its best to force them out with a brutal tactic. Because Russian combat aviation does not like to engage in dogfights, they mostly stick to fire support roles. One of the main ways they have done this in recent years is through the use of CAB 500 glide bombs. These bombs are thermobaric munitions that create massive blasts that, in the words of Ukrainian defenders, turn everything into cinders. With these nasty vacuum bombs, Russian combat aviation slowly dismantles NATO hardpoints and allows Russian troops to advance, but they're still not there yet. This is because the advanced units of the 100,000-strong relief force have made contact with the enemy. During their forced road march, US and NATO units forced running gun battles with Russian forces as they made their way to the Suwalki Gap. However, these units do not want to become encircled themselves and instead slow the pace of their advance, since it's unclear still if Russian troops will invade Poland from another direction to try and outflank the relief force. The slow movement of the relief force could spell disaster for the troops in the Suwalki Gap. With just 20 kilometers left on either side of them before being cut off, the danger of encirclement grows each day. That is, until the Navy arrives. Day 3. After clearing the Kaliningrad exclave, Snigem 1 has finally closed with Poland and the Baltic countries and is providing air defense support for Allied planes. With more than 300 vertical launch cells between them all, the Navy has done great work shooting down threats heading towards Allied planes and troop concentrations. However, this is not the only thing the Navy is doing. With almost 200 Tomahawk missiles between them, the Navy begins conducting fire missions on land to support the counteroffensive. Russian command and control centers, repair depots, armored columns, troop concentrations, and ammunition depots all become prime targets for Navy Tomahawks. However, with the inability to reload missiles at sea, Navy ships have to choose their targets wisely in such a rich environment. And though the Navy may have thought their part was done, the Russians had a surprise for them. While the Russians used Shahed drones in the opening salvos and throughout the first few days of the war, they now want to attack the US and NATO fleet with a swarm attack, never before seen in naval warfare. Launching hundreds of Shahed drones at the fleet offshore, the purpose is not necessarily to sink the Allied fleet, but to get them to expend enough ammunition to force them to pull back from the Baltic Sea for rearming. Throughout the third day, the ships of the combined US-NATO fleet fight their hardest day at sea yet. Hundreds of Shahed drones swoop in and try to take them out. After nearly 8 hours of continuous attacks, the crews are exhausted, and the damage to the fleet is extensive. Multiple ships suffered hits that caused fires, damaged equipment, and killed or injured crew members. Because of this, the Supreme Allied Command ordered Snigem 2 to head towards the Baltic at the best speed. It was already doing so, but it would take another half day to get there, just in time for what the Russians wanted. Though not a surprise to the US, the Baltic Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy has been shadowing the American Navy. Keeping outside of range, the Russians have been waiting for the Shahed drone attacks to weaken the US-NATO fleet before coming in for the kill. Knowing that help is on the way, the Russians decide to strike. The resulting engagement is the largest naval battle since World War II. More than 60 ships and several hundred aircraft participate. Throughout the day, Russian ships launch missile after missile at the US ships. With just seconds to respond, the US fleet shoots down most, but some ships, weakened by previous battle damage or out of missiles, are lost. Thankfully, as it appears the US forces might be done for, the second strike group arrives within range and begins firing naval strike missiles along with AGM-158 joint air-to-surface standoff missiles. The Baltic Sea Fleet is quickly turned into sinking hulks and breaks engagement with the US fleet. With US submarines pursuing the survivors to keep them away, US and NATO ships now rule the Baltic Sea. Day 4. After the US Navy won the day yesterday, the victory is short-lived. Back in the Suwalki Gap, American commanders are faced with a difficult decision. With US and NATO troops now surrounded on 3 sides, Supreme Allied Headquarters makes the difficult decision to abandon the Suwalki Gap and reconstitute the survivors with the now fully arrived Rapid Response Force for a counteroffensive. But the Baltics have not been abandoned. In the Baltics, the defenders continue to hold on to Vilnius as vicious street fighting continues. In the north, Estonian and Lithuanian defenders have traded more time for space, but still only have about 100 kilometers left before Russians are knocking at the gates of the capital. To bolster support for the Baltics, the Navy sends another strike group to provide around-the-clock air cover and support for the trapped defenders. In addition to this, the Marine Corps and the Army do something that's not been seen since World War II. With nearly 10,000 US and European Marines ready to go, the decision is made to send them into the fight. Though Russia tries to stop them, the Marines land unopposed behind friendly lines and head towards the fight. In addition to the Marines, the US Army conducts the largest airborne drop since World War II, when the soldiers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with elements from other NATO countries, launched the largest airborne assault since World War II. Now, with close to 20,000 reinforcements and a naval task force behind them, the defenders of the Baltics fight even harder to hold on. Day 7. Since reinforcements have been sent to the Baltics, the situation has stabilized there. Russian forces are advancing only gradually now, at just a kilometer or two per day, but in some cases, they are advancing just a few hundred meters. Because of this, Russian troops are digging in to defend the territory they have taken in Estonia and Latvia. In Lithuania, heavy street fighting continues. Scenes there are reminiscent of the battle for Bakhmut, with nearly every building destroyed by shellfire and Russian drones continually harassing Allied troops. Thankfully, due to the support of the Navy, NATO air forces totally dominate the skies. With round-the-clock close air support, the beleaguered defenders know that eventually the Russians will give up. Putin becomes increasingly frustrated with the situation. He sees the disaster that befell him trying to take Kyiv happening again, and the problem only gets worse when Ukraine does something unexpected. Agreeing to help relieve the pressure in Poland and the Baltics, Ukraine launches an unplanned counteroffensive in Kherson. Russian forces there, mostly conscripts and convicts, stripped of heavy weapons and equipment for the fight in the Baltics, flee for their lives. The war in Ukraine is now a war of movement once more. Within a matter of days, the Russian front line in Kherson collapsed due to the arrival of F-16s and a reinvigorated army that saw victory as close at hand. As the Russians abandon Kherson Oblast and flee to Crimea, President Zelensky asks for help in retaking Crimea since it's now or never. However, the US-led coalition denies this request. But why? At this moment, Biden is still seeking to avoid this becoming a world war. As it stands, the Russians have already failed to take any major cities in the Baltics, and the Rapid Response Force is making steady gains each day to retake the Suwalki Gap. With Kaliningrad Oblast being neutralized as an offensive force and Ukraine regaining Kherson, the president does not want to further escalate the war by assisting Zelensky in retaking Crimea. Besides, he couldn't even if he wanted to. This is because Turkey, though a NATO member, still controls the Bosphorus Strait because of the Montreux Agreement. This landmark agreement allows Turkey to close off the straits during times of war. However, despite Turkey now being at war with Russia, it too sees allowing NATO ships to retake Crimean land as too escalatory. Turkey also sees the writing on the wall and does not want to see the damage come to the Black Sea, since this would severely hurt the economies of several NATO members, including Romania and Bulgaria. However, Ukraine is not the only other outside theater in this war. Week 2. 1 week ago, the American fleet set sail for Europe. The massive convoy was loaded down with more than 100,000 soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen from both the US and Canada. Due to the threat of Russian submarines, the American convoy, which numbers around 100 ships, including transports, oilers, cargo vessels, and warships, did not travel in a straight line. Instead, the force zigzags erratically, hoping to throw Russian firing control solutions off. However, despite having air cover from a carrier strike group, several Russian submarines infiltrate the formation and begin firing. Several cargo ships go down, while American and Canadian warships fire torpedoes and anti-submarine rockets at their foes. After a short battle, the joint US-Canadian force sinks several Russian submarines. But as the convoy continues to Europe, US intelligence wonders how these submarines got so far into the Atlantic despite the naval blockade in the North Sea. The answer to that is Africa. Since around 2019, Russia has been actively involved in Africa, though they have mainly kept a low profile for the first few years. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, Russian PMC groups, most notably Wagner, began ramping up their efforts to court any half-wit dictator and war criminal that would hear them out. Over the past several years, Russian PMCs have seriously ramped up or begun new quote-unquote advising missions in countries like Libya, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Mali, and others. The main reason for this is the economic exploitation of these countries, where dictators give away key mining, manufacturing, publishing, and other industries that Russian oligarchs can take over. Of course, Putin gets his fair share of the profits, and this foreign cash, especially gold and oil revenue, is used to bolster his foreign reserves and help sanction-proof his empire. While the bulk of the attention in the media has been on Russian war crimes throughout Africa, one thing that Western governments failed to notice was the massive buildup of Russian arms and bases in Libya. Russia has recently courted the commander of the Libyan National Army, the terrorist army fighting the true Libyan government, to have a naval base at Tobruk in exchange for money, equipment, and fighters. With a naval base on the Mediterranean, the Russian Navy can send its submarines into the Atlantic, while the bulk of the NATO alliance is fighting pitched naval battles in the Baltic Sea or patrolling the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap to prevent Baltic Sea submarines from accessing the North Atlantic. This will have to be dealt with soon. Back on mainland Europe, the majority of the entire 300,000 Rapid Response Force has been issued equipment and has joined the fight. The Marine and paratrooper reinforcements have helped the Baltic defenders greatly. Though the Russians continue to try and punch through NATO defenses there, they run into a wall of steel every time. But there are a few problems. A massive air bridge must link Germany and Poland, with the trapped defenders in the Baltics to keep them supplied. More than 1,000 US and NATO transport aircraft are mobilized for this effort to fly in hundreds of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies each day. The Navy also regularly sends transports ashore to pick up the most seriously wounded and take them back to safety. But this might all end soon. Russian air, missile, and drone attacks are constant. They're trying their best to shake the Navy off the coast of Poland and the Baltic countries so their strikes can have more of an effect. After nearly 2 weeks of almost constant combat, the warships are almost out of missiles. With the inability to reload vertical launch systems at sea, the Supreme Allied Command makes the difficult decision to withdraw much of the fleet, to refit back in Rota, Spain, to reload their VLS cells. With the bulk of the Navy withdrawing, the ground counteroffensive loses momentum. Though US and NATO arms are of much higher quality than Russian troops, the Russians do not have far to go from their depots in Belarus or Russia to replenish the horrendous losses they are suffering on the battlefield. However, the advantage is still with the US and NATO. Due to Russia expending most of its precision weapons in the first few weeks of the war, it's low on munitions that pose any real threat to Allied air power. As a result, US and NATO aircraft pound Russian positions day and night. Additionally, US Special Forces, including SEALs, Delta Force, Rangers, and Marine Raiders, alongside NATO partners, are wreaking havoc in Russian rear areas. Altogether, with the combined power of the Allied air campaign, the constant attacks on Russian rear areas, high casualties, and a breakdown in command and control, the invaders are forced to stop where they are and dig in. Week 3. By the third week, the massive Allied convoy of ships and personnel has arrived in Europe. To avoid clogging up any one port, the convoy broke up into smaller ones. These smaller detachments headed to ports in Norway, the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece. From there, they begin disembarking and head towards pre-positioned supply bases throughout Europe. For decades, the US and NATO forces have pre-positioned supplies for just this very reason. While the massive convoy brings along huge quantities of armored vehicles, ammunition, food, and other materials, these supply depots speed things along, since soldiers at these depots have been working since day one of the invasion to get gear prepped and ready for these troops. By the end of the week, this massive invasion force has assembled and been issued their equipment. Now numbering almost 900,000 troops, the US-NATO alliance has more than twice the numerical advantage on the Russians. While Russian troops holding the Suwalki Gap and parts of the Baltics might have on paper more tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces, most of their equipment does not work, has been destroyed, or if serviceable, is vastly inferior to Western equipment. The Russians are scrambling to consolidate their gains as the Allied army consolidates for a final push to retake NATO territory. According to Russian doctrine, they build 3 separate layers of defense. The first line of defense consists of deep mine belts with hastily dug slit trenches, manned by conscripts and prisoners. The Russians do not hope to hold there, but have these men sacrificed to slow down the US and NATO troops and inflict casualties. The second line of defense consists of their best troops, which include airborne, contract infantry soldiers, and professionally trained volunteer groups. Behind these positions is a third line consisting of fewer minefields and mostly a few hardpoints manned by units recovering from fighting or just newly arrived and waiting to be rotated into more forward positions. The fight ahead of the alliance is a tough one. Having to contend with masses of infantry, dug-in tanks, dense minefields, electronic jamming systems, drones, and mass artillery barrages, this fight is nothing like the US has ever seen in its complexity or scale since World War II. However, as they push on and advance slowly by blasting lanes through the minefields, overhead, US drones and air power pound Russian positions, while artillery units conduct counter-battery fire to eliminate Russian indirect fires. However, as this massive operation unfolds, another one is happening in the Mediterranean. Before disembarking in Greece and Italy, the Allied command directed portions of the task force to take over Tobruk. Russian submarines have been causing numerous casualties, and with the bulk of the Navy reloading in port, there's little to stop them. Instead, the US and NATO forces launch an amphibious raid on Tobruk to render it inoperable. Resistance during the landings is minimal. While some Russians do stand and fight, their Libyan counterparts run for their lives. Once ashore, the Marines capture several Russian submarines still moored alongside. Several others have partially sunk due to preparatory fires from the Navy and Air Force. After the Marines blow up the captured Russian submarines, the Allied command makes the decision to occupy Tobruk for now. With the counteroffensive underway, the Allied armies will need large amounts of equipment and supplies. The sea lanes must be secured. Week 4. After several days of hard fighting and heavy casualties, US and NATO forces have broken through the first defensive lines and punched a few holes in the second. As Russia scrambles to send reinforcements to the Suwalki Gap, they divert resources from the Baltics. Sensing an opportunity, the NATO defenders launch their own vicious counterattack, which catches the Russians by surprise. But this is not the only counterattack this week. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has completely liberated Kherson Oblast and has started a new offensive in the east. With the bulk of the Russian forces transferred for the invasion of Eastern Europe, the DPR and LPR militias have been left largely to fend for themselves. Ukrainian forces easily punch through their lines and begin retaking territory not held since before 2014. With Allied armies counterattacking across every front, Putin knows the writing is on the wall. With his army unable to take any of the Baltic capitals, the loss of Kherson Oblast, the loss of Tobruk, the loss of his Baltic Sea fleet, and the imminent defeat on the battlefield in Poland, he knows there are not very many ways to spin this as a victory back home. However, Putin does not want to give in, and instead wants to double down his efforts. Though Putin has avoided general mobilization, he consults his trusted Siloviki about what to do now. They urge him to pull back what remains of Russian forces in the Baltics and Poland before they get cut off and destroyed. They try to convince him that they can spin this as having taught NATO a lesson, and maybe they can negotiate for what territory they still hold in Ukraine. But Putin is having none of it. Instead, he doubles down that he wants to declare general mobilization and commit the Russian people to a generation of war. That's when the Siloviki turn the tables on Putin. This group of roughly a dozen men carry out Putin's will in Russia and can control the military, police, and intelligence services. They unanimously threaten Putin that if he does not back down now, something might happen to him like what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Sensing that he's lost control, Putin gives in and tells the Siloviki he will ask for a ceasefire. Putin calls an emergency meeting with Allied headquarters in Brussels. He wants a ceasefire in which Russian troops will maintain their current positions. However, the Allies want none of that. They tell him that unless Russia withdraws from all NATO territory back to the international border, they will continue the offensive until that goal is achieved. When he asks if he can keep the territory in Ukraine, the answer is a resounding no. The US directs Putin to withdraw all his forces back to the international borders before the 2014 annexation. If he does not, the war will continue with a US-led offensive that will force him to do so. Fearing that he would face more unrest at home due to general mobilization than losing illegally gained territory, Putin agrees. Though the war is now over, Putin assures his inner circle that he will not give up until he is dead. Whether he will actually live to see that day is now anyone's guess. But what do you think? Could the strategies outlined actually play out this way, or would there be unexpected twists and turns? Drop your thoughts and predictions in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to The Military Show for more military-related content. Now go and check out If China and the US Go to War, Who Loses, Hour by Hour, or click this other video instead.